Chapter 14. Business. As the battle neared its end, intermittent gunfire still sporadically pierced the air, and the battleground was swathed in smoke, with the trenches chaotically filled with bodies. Approximately 6 or 7 Vietnamese soldiers remained in the tunnels, and I had my men seal off all the exits. The frontline combat troops were issued a battlefield handbook, which contained common Vietnamese phrases annotated with Chinese characters for pronunciation. From the mouth of the tunnel, I shouted in Vietnamese a common phrase meaning, "Surrender, and you will not be killed. Prisoners will be treated well." The encircled Vietnamese responded from deep within the tunnel with a volley of bullets. Throwing my steel helmet to the ground in exasperation, I cursed, "Motherfuck!" They still refused to be captured alive. I turned to the soldiers behind me and commanded, "Bundle the hand grenades and ready the flamethrowers. Let's go all out on them." Cluster grenades and flamethrowers were the most effective weapons against enemies entrenched in tunnels, first to suppress with a barrage of grenades, then to annihilate with flames. Bundles of grenades were tossed into the tunnels, followed by a series of violent explosions. Then, the Chinese soldiers held the flamethrowers steady at the tunnel entrance and swept them with fire. The smell of gunpowder mixed with the stench of burned flesh was overwhelming, making it nearly impossible to keep our eyes open. Leading with a submachine gun, I entered the tunnel, eager to see the charred remains of the scrawny Vietnamese soldiers. Inside, more than a dozen blackened bodies of the Vietnamese army were scattered about, indistinguishable whether they had been blasted or burned to death. Towards the innermost part, we discovered a bunch of unexploded cluster grenades. I hurriedly led the soldiers out, but it was already too late. A dull explosion rocked us, throwing me to the ground as a shockwave passed over, and darkness engulfed my sight as if my eyes had been smeared with mud, obscuring my vision completely. In a frantic scramble, my hands clawed at the air as indescribable fear gripped me. Then, someone grasped my wrist and said reassuringly, "Comrade, wake up. Are you having a nightmare?" My eyes flew open to the concerned gazes of 2 train attendants and a carriage full of passengers, their faces a mix of concern and amusement. It dawned on me then that I had been dreaming. Breathing a long sigh of relief, I still felt the residual fear from the nightmare. Embarrassed by the disruption, I gave the passengers a sheepish smile, probably the most awkward smile I have ever mustered. Thank goodness there wasn't a mirror. I couldn't bear to see my own sheepish expression. The attendant noticed I was awake and mentioned we were nearing the last stop, suggesting I get ready to depart. I nodded, collected my luggage, and shuffled to the connection between the train carriages, perching on my suitcase. Lighting a cigarette, I inhaled deeply, my mind still wrapped around my comrades on the front line. Wearing my uniform without its distinctive insignia and cap badge was disconcerting, to say the least. I felt out of place, as if I'd even forgotten how to walk properly. The thought of facing my father made it even worse. If he learned that I had been discharged from the army, he'd probably be as angry as to lash me with his belt. After the train arrived at the station, I circled my house but couldn't bring myself to go inside right away. Instead, I wandered the streets aimlessly, trying to come up with some plausible story to mollify my father. As evening approached and twilight started to set in, I ventured into a restaurant to grab a bite. The prices on the menu were a shock. It had been years since I'd last dined out, and I couldn't believe how expensive everything had gotten. 6 yuan for a plate of fish-flavored shredded pork seemed outrageous, and I realized that my severance pay of just over 3,000 yuan would only suffice for about 500 servings of that dish. I ordered 2 bowls of rice and a plate of kung pao chicken, as well as a bottle of beer. When the young waitress insistently recommended some oil-braised large shrimp, I firmly declined her upsell. She muttered under her breath and rolled her eyes, huffing as she turned away to fetch my order. I chose not to lower myself to an argument. After all, I had served as a soldier for a full 10 years, sweated and bled, faced life and death. It seemed laughable that all that would be worth only 500 servings of fish-flavored shredded pork. But then, I quickly reminded myself, compared to my comrades who had sacrificed their lives on the battlefield and in the mountains, what right did I have to feel discontent? Their sacrifices put everything into perspective and gratitude, not grievance, filled my thoughts. At that moment, another customer walked into the restaurant. He was wearing a pair of large sunglasses that seemed to be a knockoff of an American style. He had a trendy look for those times, so I couldn't help but take a longer glance. The man noticed me too, and sized me up before walking over and sitting directly opposite me at my table. I was puzzled by his forwardness, wondering why he'd choose to sit with me when there were plenty of other empty tables. I thought perhaps he was a troublemaker looking for a fight. Perfect, I thought. I had been itching for some action, but his face seemed somewhat familiar, although it was mostly shielded by the big sunglasses, and I couldn't immediately recall who he was. The man adjusted his sunglasses on his nose and said, "Tan Wang Gai Di Hu, the king covers the earth tiger." The phrase struck a chord, and I instinctively responded, "Bal Tarjun Heyao, the pagoda subdues the river demon." He then asked, "Why's your face red?" I gave a thumbs up and joked, "Can't find a wife, so I'm all in a rush." "And now it's white again?" "Got married to a tigress, and she scared me pale." We both then embraced, laughing. "Fatty, bet you never thought the Central Red Army would make a comeback, huh?" I remarked. Fatty, who was almost tearful with joy, replied, "Who? Can't believe that all fronts of the Red Army are finally reunited in Shaanxi." We'd exchanged letters over the years, but had never managed to meet given the distance. It was such a coincidence to run into each other in town, of all places. Fatty's dad had held a higher rank than my own father, but unfortunately, he didn't survive the Cultural Revolution and died in one of the camps. A few years after Fatty returned to the city, he found a job, worked for over a year. Then, after a fight with his boss, struck out on his own as a dealer, trafficking popular music tapes from our area to the north. After years apart, we rejoined and drank until our faces turned red. I completely forgot about fabricating a story, and once home, in my drunken state, I told my father everything. Unexpectedly, he wasn't angry. Instead, he was overjoyed. I thought to myself, this old man, his understanding diminishes with age. He's even glad that his son can no longer make it to the front lines. The reemployment office offered me a job as the deputy chief of the security department at a food factory, but after years in the army, I wasn't keen on settling into a regular 9-to-5 life, so I declined. Instead, I decided to go into business with Fatty up north. Time passed swiftly, and before we knew it, we had entered the 1980s. Now well into our 30s, our business was growing increasingly grim. The notion of saving for marriage was laughable. We were nearing the point where even affording daily meals was becoming a struggle. We often had to ask our families for money to help with immediate financial crises. According to the declarations made during the third plenary session, the entire nation had essentially resolved the issue of food and clothing shortages. Yet, it felt to us as though we were stuck in the era before liberation, oppressed and exploited, barely able to feed and clothe ourselves. On this particular day, with perfect weather and cloudless skies, we each wore a pair of sunglasses matched with flared trousers and pushed a tricycle along the streets of Beijing. We mounted a plank on the cart filled with cassette tapes, playing popular Taiwanese songs loudly through a shabby tape recorder connected to a couple of worn-out speakers. A bespectacled female student drifted over, browsing for a while, then asked us, "Do you have any Wang Jiesher Anxia Li Su tapes?" We had stocked them before, but they had sold out just 2 days ago. Fatty addressed her with a cheeky grin. "Oh, my dear, what era are you still living in, listening to their songs? Have you listened to Deng Lijun or Zhang Aijia? Take a few tape reels with you. I can assure you, in Chairman Mao's memory, they are excellent listens." The student, dubious of Fatty's character, turned and left. Fatty started to rant and complained after her. The nerve of that idiot, trying to act all sophisticated. She wants gold threads, silver threads? Looks like she's the spitting image of a spindle. I ribbed him, saying, "Why have you suddenly taken up a Beijing accent? Can't you speak standard Mandarin? Pretending to be a local, huh? Business is too tough here in Beijing. Let's head to Xi'an in a few days." Fatty, attempting to assert that his ancestors were from Beijing, was interrupted by a sudden commotion. He pointed down the street and exclaimed, "Damn! Here comes the Industrial and Commercial Bureau. Run!" We sprinted with the tricycle, turning this way and that until we ended up on a street which, to my surprise, turned out to be Pangaean Antique Market. The street was lined with all sorts of second-hand goods. There were even people buying old Chairman Mao badges and little red books. The place had it all: various pots and jars, old clocks and timepieces, antiquated shoes worn by women with bound feet, piles upon piles of old coins, snuff bottles, all kinds and sorts of antique furniture, smoking pipes, calligraphy and paintings, carved ink stones, ink sticks, yellow paper, old pipes, cricket jars, porcelain, lacquerware, and all manner of jewelry made from gold, silver, copper, iron, tin, and various types of jade. Anything old and venerable could be found there.